Have you ever considered the promises we make to those we love, especially in their final moments? We whisper assurances of eternal remembrance, of a love that transcends even the grave. But what if the grave doesn't see it that way? What if a love, so fierce and possessive, refuses to be severed by death? What if it clings, not as a cherished memory, but as a ravenous hunger? In some cultures, there is a belief in ghost marriages, a way to unite souls in the afterlife. It is often seen as an act of compassion, of ensuring a loved one is not alone in the spirit world. But love, like any powerful force, has a shadow. And sometimes, when a promise is made under the duress of grief and desperation, it forges not a bond of eternal peace, but a chain of unending horror. This is the story of such a promise. A story of a man named Ming Fun and the chilling price he paid for a love that refused to die. It is a tale that unravels in the humid nights of Malaysia, a place where the veil between worlds can sometimes feel perilously thin. It's a story I know all too well, for I have seen how love can curdle into something monstrous, how a whisper of devotion can become a scream that echoes for eternity. Our story begins in the year 2007 in a modest, cramped apartment in the outskirts of Kuala Lumpur. Here lived Ming Fun, a quiet, unassuming man in his late 40s who worked the lonely night shift as a security guard at a local textile factory. His world, once filled with the gentle hum of a shared life, had shrunk to the four walls of this apartment and the sterile silence of the factory after dark. His life revolved around one person, his wife, Hui Ling. For months, he had watched her fade, a cruel illness chipping away at the vibrant woman he had married. The apartment, once filled with the scent of jasmine and her laughter, now smelled of medicinal herbs and the quiet dread of impending loss. The final day came cloaked in the oppressive afternoon heat. The air was thick and still, the only sound the rattling whir of an old ceiling fan. Hui Ling lay in their bed, a fragile figure against the worn sheets. Her face, though pale and gaunt, still held the ghost of her beauty. She reached for Ming Fun's hand, her grip surprisingly strong, almost desperate. Her eyes, usually soft and loving, now burned with a feverish intensity, a desperate fire against the encroaching darkness. He leaned in close, his heart a leaden weight in his chest, as she whispered her final words. Her voice was a reedy rasp, each word a monumental effort. She spoke of her fear of being alone, of the cold, silent eternity that awaited her. And then she made her demand, her final binding request. "Don't let me be alone," she rasped, her fingers tightening like a vice around his. "Promise me. Promise me you will always be mine. Promise you will never let another take my place." And what could he do? In the face of his profound grief, overwhelmed by love and loss, he would have promised her the moon and the stars. He promised her his unwavering, eternal devotion. As he spoke the words, a strange stillness fell over the room. The red silk scarf she always wore, a vibrant slash of color against her pale skin, seemed to almost glow for a moment in the dim light filtering through the worn curtains. Then, with a final shuddering breath, Hui Ling was gone. The silence that followed was absolute, a crushing weight that seemed to suck all the air from the room. Ming Fun sat there for hours, her cold hand still in his, the echo of his promise hanging in the air like a shroud. In the days that followed the funeral, a deep, unnerving quiet settled over the apartment. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of solitude, but a watchful, expectant silence. Ming Fun kept her belongings just as she had left them. Her clothes still hung in the closet, her favorite teacup sat on the kitchen counter, and the red silk scarf, he draped it over the bedpost, a constant, vivid reminder of his love and his vow. The first strange occurrence was small, almost dismissible. A week after her death, he came home from his night shift, bone-weary and hollowed out by grief, to find the red scarf on the floor, pooled at the foot of the bed as if it had slipped. He picked it up, his fingers tracing the smooth fabric, and placed it back on the bedpost, chalking it up to a draft or the vibration of a passing truck. But a few nights later, he found it again, this time laid out perfectly straight on her side of the bed, almost as if someone had been waiting for him. A cold prickle of unease traced its way down his spine. He tried to rationalize it, to tell himself it was just his grieving mind playing tricks on him. But the feeling of being watched, A constant, oppressive sensation began to take root in the corners of his mind. He was no longer alone in his grief. He was being haunted by it. The subtle disturbances soon bled into something far more sinister, a creeping dread that seeped into every moment of his waking life and tormented his attempts at sleep. The quiet apartment became a theater of unnerving events. Doors he knew he had closed would be found slightly ajar. Objects would move from their places. A photograph of Hui Ling turned to face him. The teacup shifted to the edge of the counter as if about to fall. The scent of jasmine, once a comfort, now became a herald of her presence, a cloying, sickly, sweet smell that would appear suddenly and vanish just as quickly, often accompanied by a dramatic drop in temperature that would raise goosebumps on his arms. Sleep offered no escape. His dreams were plagued by visions of Hui Ling, not as the beautiful wife he remembered, but as something else. He would see her standing in a desolate, muddy field, her wedding dress stained and torn, her eyes holding an expression of profound loneliness and a terrifying, burgeoning hunger. He would wake up in a cold sweat, his heart hammering against his ribs, the feeling of her spectral gaze lingering on him long after he opened his eyes. The lack of sleep began to wear on him. At his job, he found it hard to concentrate. The long, silent corridors of the textile factory, once a place of mundane routine, now felt menacing. Every flicker of the fluorescent lights, every distant clang of machinery settling in the night, sent a jolt of fear through him. His coworker, a kind, middle-aged man named Raman, noticed the change. Ming Fun, once diligent and composed, was now jumpy and haggard. Dark circles bloomed under his eyes, and his already slender frame became gaunt. "Are you all right, Ming?" Raman would ask, his brow furrowed with concern. "You look like you haven't slept in a week." Ming Fun would just shake his head, offering a weak, dismissive wave. How could he explain? How could he tell Raman that he was being haunted by his dead wife, that his grief had taken on a terrifying, tangible form? He sounded insane even to himself. The isolation deepened his paranoia. He started talking to her, whispering into the empty rooms of his apartment. "Hui Ling, please," he would beg the silence. "Leave me be. I love you, but you are gone. Please, find peace." But his pleas were met only with an escalation of the activity. One night, he was jolted awake by a sound from the living room. It was a soft, dragging noise, like fabric being pulled across the floor. With trembling hands he crept out of bed and peered into the dim hallway. The red silk scarf was moving. It slithered across the wooden floor like a crimson snake, inching its way towards his bedroom door. He watched, frozen in a state of pure, unadulterated terror, as it coiled at his threshold before becoming utterly still. He slammed the door shut, his back pressed against it, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The barrier felt laughably insufficient. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that she was right outside, waiting. His growing desperation led him to Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman who lived in the apartment below him. She was a devout Buddhist, her small home filled with the scent of incense and the quiet presence of spiritual trinkets. He had seen her lighting joss sticks and leaving offerings at a small altar on her balcony. One afternoon, unable to bear the oppressive silence of his own apartment any longer, he knocked on her door. He needed to talk to someone, anyone. He started by speaking of his grief, of his loneliness, but as Mrs. Chen listened with a patient, knowing sadness, the dam of his fear finally broke. He told her everything. The moving objects, the scent of jasmine, the nightmarish dreams, the slithering scarf. He expected her to look at him with pity, to think he was losing his mind. Instead, her weathered face grew pale, her eyes widening with a look of dawning horror and recognition. She clutched the prayer beads that were always in her hands, her knuckles turning white. She didn't think he was crazy. She believed him, and that somehow was even more terrifying. Mrs. Chen listened, her expression growing more grave with every word Ming Fun uttered. When he finished, his voice a hoarse whisper. The silence in her small, cluttered apartment was thick with a shared dread. She looked at him, her eyes filled not with disbelief, but with a deep, ancestral fear. "This is not simple grief, Ming Fun," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Her spirit is tied to you. That promise you made, it was a chain. she holds you to it. She explained the old beliefs, stories whispered down through generations about spirits who, in their great love or great sorrow, refuse to cross over. They become tethered to the living, their loneliness twisting into a possessive, dangerous force. Her attachment is too strong, Mrs. Chen continued, her gaze drifting towards the ceiling, as if she could feel the oppressive presence in the apartment above. She doesn't want to let you go. And a spirit like that, their hunger only grows. That very night, the haunting reached its horrifying zenith. The slow burn of dread erupted into a full-blown inferno of terror. Ming Fun lay on his bed, the thin sheets pulled up to his chin, every nerve screaming. The air in the room was unnaturally cold, heavy and thick like grave dirt. The usual hum of the city outside was gone, replaced by a profound, deathly silence. A shadow in the corner of the room near the doorway began to deepen, coalescing from the ambient darkness into something solid, something impossibly wrong. From that pool of absolute black, a figure began to emerge. It was Hui Ling, but a grotesque parody of the woman he had loved. Her form was twisted, her limbs bent at unnatural angles, as if they had been snapped and crudely reset. The beautiful face he cherished was now a gaunt, hollowed-out mask, the skin pulled tight over her skull with a sickly grayish pallor. Her eyes were sunken pits, but from their depths burned a pair of glowing, malevolent embers that radiated an unholy hunger. Her traditional Chinese dress, the one she was buried in, was tattered and stained with what looked like grave mud. Long, skeletal fingers, the nails yellowed and sharp, reached for him, twitching in the stagnant air. But the most horrifying part was her mouth. Her jaw hung open, dislocated and impossibly wide, revealing not teeth or a tongue, but a swirling black void, an abyss that promised utter annihilation. Her long, stringy hair moved as if it were underwater, floating around her head in a nauseating ballet. And around her neck, the red silk scarf, no longer a symbol of love but an emblem of damnation, floated as if it were a noose, its ends writhing like living things. Ming Fun was paralyzed, frozen in sheer mind-shattering terror on his bed. A scream was trapped in his throat, a silent, agonizing shriek. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't look away from the monstrous apparition of his wife. The figure took a jerky, unnatural step into the room, the sound of cracking bone echoing in the silence. The void of her mouth seemed to widen, and a low, guttural moan emanated from it, a sound of eternal pain and insatiable need. It was a sound that vibrated not in his ears, but in his very soul. It was the sound of his promise, twisted into a curse. The specter glided closer, its burning eyes fixed on him, the skeletal fingers reaching. Just as the icy tip of her finger was about to touch his skin, the spell of his paralysis broke. With a choked sob, Ming Fun scrambled backwards off the bed, crashing against the far wall. He didn't stop. He fumbled for the doorknob, wrenched the door open, and fled his apartment, his bare feet slapping against the cool concrete of the hallway. He didn't stop running until he was pounding on Mrs. Chen's door, his knuckles raw, his mind a maelstrom of terror. When she opened it, his wild, haunted eyes and gasping sobs told her everything. The confrontation had come. The raw, terrifying truth of his predicament was laid bare. This was beyond pleas and prayers. It was a spiritual war for his very soul, and he was losing. "We must find help, Mrs. Chen said, her voice firm despite the fear in her eyes. "We must find someone who understands these things. We must find a master." Following Mrs. Chen's urgent counsel, they embarked on a journey the very next day. She knew of a man, a spiritual practitioner named Master Liu, who lived in a small, unassuming temple on the outskirts of the city, a place sought out only by those in the deepest of spiritual turmoil. The journey itself felt surreal to Ming Fun, the vibrant, sun-drenched streets of Kuala Lumpur, a stark contrast to the shadowy horror that now consumed his life. He felt like a ghost himself, disconnected from the living world around him. Master Liu was an elderly Chinese man, his face a roadmap of deep lines etched by time and wisdom. He wore simple, traditional robes, and his eyes, though clouded with age, held a piercing clarity that seemed to see right through Ming Fun's terror and into the heart of his haunting. He received them in a small, dark room, the air thick with the sweet, heavy scent of sandalwood incense. He listened patiently as Ming Fun, prompted by Mrs. Chen, recounted his story, his voice cracking with exhaustion and fear. Ming Fun had brought the red silk scarf, now feeling impossibly heavy and cold, in a small bag. He placed it on the low table between them. Master Liu didn't touch it, but his eyes narrowed as he looked at the vibrant piece of cloth. When Ming Fun finished, Master Liu was silent for a long time, his gaze distant. "You are bound by a yin contract," he finally said, his voice low and resonant. "A promise made to the dying, fueled by intense emotion. It is one of the strongest bonds there is." Her love for you was possessive, her fear of loneliness, absolute. In death, these emotions have not faded. They have festered. She does not see this as haunting. She sees it as claiming what is hers, your soul. He explained the dark lore behind such attachments. A spirit like Huiling, trapped between worlds by the anchor of a promise, becomes a hungry ghost. Their initial loneliness curdles into a desperate, insatiable need to feel alive again, a need that can only be satisfied by consuming the life force, the qi, of the living. "She is starving," Master Liu stated, his words landing like stones in the silent room. "And your life force alone is no longer enough to sustain her." The true horror of his situation began to dawn on Ming Fun. This was not just about his own torment. Huiling's hunger was growing, and it would need to be fed. Master Liu knew what had to be done. Not an exorcism to sever such a powerful bond violently could shatter Ming Fun's spirit, but a ritual of understanding, of divination, to learn the full extent of her demands and to find a way to appease her. That evening, the ritual began. Ming Fun knelt on a cushion before a small altar covered in prayer papers, inscribed with ancient characters. The room was illuminated only by the flickering light of a dozen red candles, which cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, making the serene statues of deities look menacing. Master Liu donned ceremonial robes and began to chant in a low, melodic tone, a language that felt ancient and powerful. He lit thick bundles of joss sticks, and the smoke, dense and ethereal, curled around them, obscuring and revealing the room in hypnotic waves. The air grew heavy, charged with an almost electric tension. Master Liu took the red silk scarf and laid it carefully in the center of the altar. He then produced 3 ancient worn coins, their surfaces smooth from countless hands. He gestured for Ming Fun to hold out his hands. With a pair of tongs, the master picked up a piece of burning charcoal from a brazier and placed it in the center of a small dish. He instructed Ming Fun to ask his question, to project his desperate plea into the smoke-filled room. "What do you want from me?" Ming Fun whispered, his voice trembling. Master Liu dropped the coins onto the dish, where they sizzled against the hot charcoal. He studied their configuration, his brow furrowed in concentration. He chanted again, his voice rising in intensity, before looking at Ming Fun with grave, sorrowful eyes. "She does not want to harm you," the master revealed, his voice barely above a whisper. "You are her anchor. She wants you to stay with her forever. But her hunger, it is a void that cannot be filled. She demands a sacrifice, not your life, but the lives of others." The words hung in the air, more chilling than any ghostly apparition. The candles flickered wildly, and a sudden icy draft swept through the room, extinguishing half of them and plunging the space into deeper shadow. The smoke from the incense swirled violently, for a fleeting moment taking on a gaunt, feminine form with a gaping maw. Huiling wasn't just haunting him, she was demanding that he become a killer. She wanted him to feed her the souls of others, to become a purveyor of death, to sustain her spectral existence, and keep her from consuming him entirely. He was faced with an impossible, monstrous choice: sacrifice his own soul to save himself, or become a monster to appease the one he once loved. The ride back from the temple was a blur of muted colors and distant sounds. Master Liu's horrifying revelation had hollowed Ming Fun out, leaving behind a chilling, pragmatic despair. The choice, as monstrous as it was, had already been made in the deepest, most terrified recess of his heart. The instinct for survival, primal and absolute, had eclipsed love, morality, and reason. He was not a good man, he realized, just a man who did not want to die, who did not want his life force to be drained away into that black, silent void he had seen in his wife's spectral mouth. He was to feed the ghost. The hauntings in his apartment did not stop, but their nature shifted. The terrifying, aggressive displays ceased. The grotesque apparitions vanished. Instead, Hui Ling's presence became a constant, expectant pressure at the edge of his senses. It was the scent of jasmine when he opened the door to a potential victim, a cold touch on his hand as he guided them to a secluded spot, a faint, approving whisper in his mind when their life force was released, a shimmering, ethereal mist he could now perceive, funneling from the fresh corpse and into the shadows where she perpetually waited. He was still a security guard at the textile factory, a predator hiding in plain sight. His job, once a source of mundane boredom, now provided the perfect hunting ground. The factory was vast, isolated, and operated 24 hours a day, attracting transient workers, desperate individuals who would not be easily missed. His first victim was a young man, new to the city, who had been caught trying to steal a roll of fabric. Ming Fun had cornered him in a desolate storage warehouse. He remembered the boy's pleas, the terror in his eyes. He also remembered the icy chill that enveloped him, the whisper of Hui Ling's name in the back of his skull, and the surge of unnatural strength that flowed through his arms. After it was done, as he watched the young man's last breath fog in the cool air, he felt a wave of profound peace wash over him. The gnawing hunger that had been draining him for weeks was satiated, and for the first time in a long time, he slept soundly. The apartment was quiet. His wife was content, and so the cycle began. Ming Fun became a phantom in the night, his gaunt frame and hollow eyes now tools of his trade, disarming those he targeted. One disappearance could be a fluke. Two, a coincidence. But soon, a pattern began to emerge, a quiet stain of fear spreading through the community of factory workers. People spoke in hushed tones of a curse on the factory, of men vanishing without a trace. No one suspected the quiet, haunted-looking security guard who patrolled the halls at night. One evening, several months into his new, horrific existence, his co-worker Rahman sat down opposite him in the starkly lit break room. He pushed a newspaper across the table. Rahman's face was etched with a mixture of confusion and sorrow. He pointed a trembling finger at the bold headline, "Local Security Guard Missing." Below it, a smaller headline read, "Mysterious Disappearances Continue." And there, next to the text, was a picture of Ming Fun, his work ID photo, looking tired but otherwise normal. "They think you're missing, Ming," Rahman said, his voice low. "Your landlord reported it. No one has seen you come or go from your apartment in weeks." Ming Fun simply stared at his own face on the page, a ghost looking at his own obituary. He was missing. The man he used to be was long gone, devoured not by his ghost wife, but by the choices he made to appease her. He was now just a vessel, an instrument of her eternal hunger. Rahman looked at the empty chair beside Ming Fun, a place where another guard, one of the first to vanish, used to sit. He connected the dots, not with logic, but with a dawning, instinctual dread. The profound shock of realization washed over his face. He wasn't sitting with his colleague, he was sitting with a monster. The man he knew was gone, and something terrible was sitting in his place. It's a chilling thought, isn't it, that the deepest love can become the most monstrous cage. Ming Fun made a promise in a moment of grief, a vow to never let his wife be alone. He kept that promise. He built her a prison of souls, and in doing so, locked himself inside. The quiet of his apartment was no longer the silence of loss, but the silence of a well-fed predator. The red silk scarf, draped over the bedpost, no longer looked like a memento, but a leash. The immediate threat to his own life was gone, but his soul was irrevocably stained, forever bound to the gruesome task of feeding the abyss. I often wonder, as I drift through the quiet places of this world, witnessing the echoes of such tragedies, what would you have done? When faced with the choice between your own annihilation and becoming a monster, what path would you choose? How much would you sacrifice, not for love, but for the simple, desperate fear of being consumed by the dark.